So,
Deltarune Chapter 2 came out, which set the internet ablaze so hard that the Wi-Fi went out in the actual game. So much new information, so many new possibilities, so many explosions! And of course, let's not forget that everyone's in disarray trying to sort through all the new information since its release. A piece of history that will definitely repeat once chapters 3, 4, and 5 come out and debunk every one of those theories, including this one. And so with that in mind, for this video, my goal is not to make any solid conclusions, but rather to just go over all the evidence and possibilities so we can get closer to an answer in the future. An answer to probably the game's biggest question as of now: who is the Knight? A figure that's been mentioned time and time again that appears to be set up as our main antagonist. But the important part here is that the Knight is unlikely to be a brand new character like King or Queen, and so their true identity may be that of someone we already know. So with all that said, let's start combing through what we've learned so far. The Knight is first mentioned by Sham, who describes them as showing up one day, putting King and Lancer into power and imprisoning the other three kings, not without a struggle of course. And then after King swore to the Knight that he would protect the fountain, they disappeared and have not returned since. And the reason the Knight was able to just up and vanish is because they're actually a Lightner, or rather a real person not from the Dark World, just like Chris and Susie. The Knight is stated by both King and Queen as the one who creates the Dark Fountains, and we later learn that only Lightners have the capability to create them, if one is simply determined enough. And if the Knight is a Lightner, then it can therefore be assumed they are also somebody living in town. After all, the road to the outside world is blocked, and all the fountains so far have been located somewhere inside. First the supply closet, then the spare classroom, and lastly the computer lab. And speaking of the computer lab, its Dark World did not exist the previous day, as when you inspect the door during the epilogue of Chapter 1, you can look through the window to see that the room is normal. Whereas when an area's been converted into a Dark World, you cannot see anything at all. Rousey even comments on how a new Dark Fountain is opened when you get there. Therefore, the fountain must have been created sometime during the night. The night strikes at night, how fitting. And why is the Knight going around making all these fountains? Well, they're trying to end the world. Duh. After the fight with Giga Queen, Rousey tells us about the Roaring, a world-ending event caused by the existence of too many dark fountains, and is why we need to seal each one that appears, with the exception of the one in Castletown. And, bad news, but the Roaring is definitely gonna happen. For you see, the legend that Rousey shares at the beginning of the game details that 3 heroes will emerge once the end of the world has already commenced. And let's be real, they wouldn't set up this calamity only for it to not happen. That's just not how it works. Every time a game or show or movie establishes that doing Y will cause X event, despite the character's efforts, it always happens. Thanos will snap his fingers and kill half the universe. The Serpentine will collect all 4 Fang Blades to summon the Great Devourer. And the Knight will succeed in unleashing the Roaring. But of course, if it's the Knight that's creating the fountains, that brings up another perplexing question. Who's the other guy? You see, when you talk to Sham, he doesn't just mention a strange knight. He also mentions a strange someone who caused Jevil to eventually go insane. And the thing is, this strange someone, who I will be referring to as the other for convenience, cannot be the same entity as the knight. For you see, Jevil recounts that he was locked up by the Boring Kings. Plural. And if you'll recall, when the Knight appeared, the other 3 kings were locked away, leaving only one. So whoever drove Jevil to madness somehow made it to Card Castle before the Knight did. But how? If the Knight is truly the one who created the fountain in the spare classroom, then how could the other have gotten there first? Did they use shortcuts? And how did they even know about the fountain in the first place? Because in case you didn't know, the other is a Lightner as well. A piece of information we only have thanks to... Alright, let's talk about Spamton. Just like Jevil, Spamton has also had close contact with the other, albeit a more long-distance one. Spamton didn't meet the other in person, rather they met over the phone. And from that moment on, Spamton suddenly became a huge success, a big shot if you will, making deals, sales, buying fancy rooms, the whole shebang. All thanks to the advice of this mysterious individual. But then the line went dark, the flow of advice stopped, and Spamton's success came crashing down, with the phone's other end apparently producing nothing but garbage noise. A line we should all be well familiar with is when you try to use Chris's phone, this same prompt appears. Why? Well, the phone works just fine when you're in the real world, and despite being in the Dark World, Spamton's phone was also perfectly functional until a certain point. So it can therefore be assumed that calls made to phones existing in the same world go through without a problem, but calls that try to bridge both worlds only result in garbage noise. Don't forget, Chris's phone only has one number, that being Toriel's phone located in the real world. That's why using the phone in the Dark World always fails. So with that in mind, if Spamton's phone was producing garbage noise and is the same number he'd been calling for advice all this time, then it can only be assumed that the other is another Lightner. While they were in the Dark World, it makes sense that the calls would go through, but when they returned to the real world, of course it meant Spamton was cut off. Whew. So to recap, we have two assholes running amok in the dark world. The first one, the Roaring Knight, who plans to end the world by creating dark fountains and then tricking the local darkness into protecting said fountains to prevent them from being sealed. And the other one, an unnamed mysterious individual whose goals are unknown, has been seen meddling with specific darkness and giving them cursed knowledge. So who are these douchebags? Well, let's finally discuss candidates. To get the mystery man out of the room right away, Gaster. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that he may be the other. As we all know, Deltarune makes several references to the mysterious Entry 17, a data log supposedly written by Gaster hiding in Undertale's files. While reminiscing about the things Jevil told him about what he'd learned from the other, some remarks on how his view of the world has grown darker, yet darker, which mirrors a segment from Entry 17. And the background noise you hear during Entry 17 is also the infamous garbage noise. Meaning that if Entry 17 was in fact written by Gaster, then the existence of the noise there means that he could have been contacting the dark world at that moment. Oh yeah, there's also the egg rooms, where if you walk between two different screens over and over, you have a random chance of entering a secret room between them, with a tree and a man behind the tree who gives you an egg. The way these rooms appear is not dissimilar to the fake hallway that can sometimes appear in Undertale, which can then contain a door to a room where you can meet someone that is commonly believed to be Gaster. So the whole secret room between two other rooms thing would be quite on brand. However, that also poses a problem. Spamton. Remember Spamton? His whole deal is that he's obsessed with reliving his big shot days, always waiting for that phone to ring, for a call from the other. But of course, as we all know, he can't contact them because while they're in the real world, communication via phone doesn't go through and just results in garbage noise. Do you see the problem? The mysterious man behind the tree is right here. He's in the dark world. Theoretically, Spamton could call him right now, and it would work. Yet he still acts as though he's abandoned. So if the man behind the tree is Gaster, then likewise the other is not Gaster. And if the other is Gaster, then the man behind the tree is not Gaster. Or in other words, we may just have to go ahead and say that the man behind the tree is a third stranger to this world. Which, believe it or not, would actually tie back to Entry 17, with the infamous ending line of "What do you two think?" implying that three people are involved with this mysterious project. And besides, it's not impossible that all these references to Gaster are just here to confuse us. I mean, come on, that one stray pixel that was there in King's throne room is also there in Queen's throne room. Toby Fox 100% totally would attempt to troll us. That's to take all this info with a grain of salt. For now, let's go back to the knight whose prime candidate is, of course, Chris. Queen tells us that if a lightner were just determined enough, then they could take a blade in hand and create a dark fountain all on their own. The very thing we see transpire with Chris at the end of Chapter 2. They take out their knife, plunge it into the earth, and smoke begins to bellow into the room, just as described by the video of the Cyberworld fountain's creation. Chris is an interesting character because we know a lot about them, but at the same time we know almost nothing about them. And since the player's in control for most of the game, Chris doesn't really have the chance to express themselves in any way. That is, until the end of each chapter where Chris rips us out in order to cause some kind of mischief. Whether that be eating all of the butterscotch cinnamon pie during the night, sneaking out to slash the tires of Toriel's car, or, as we all know, creating a dark fountain in the living room. Yes, it's all very suspicious. And since we weren't in control of Chris at the end of Chapter 1, you could easily make the argument that Chris broke into the computer lab that night to create the fountain there. Plus, let's not forget that while in the dark world, Chris actually wears knight's armor with a sword and everything. So cool, it seems pretty clear cut, right? Chris created at least one of the dark fountains and definitely looks the part as well. There's one problem though. Many characters are familiar with the knights, some even swearing complete loyalty to them. But the thing is, no one, not King, not Queen, not Sham, not Jevil, nobody recognizes Chris as the knight. Which is especially apparent with King, who was very ready to straight up kill Chris. Pretty awkward if it turned out Chris was actually King's boss. Now I know what you're thinking, Chris could have been using a disguise. It's not impossible, but it's not just that no one recognizes Chris, the motivation doesn't line up either. The knight's goal is to end the world by creating dark fountains and then leaving them be, right? So why is Chris going out of their way to seal the fountains? Well, that's an easy one. It's because we're controlling Chris and making them act against their own will. Nah, that's not it. While we do see Chris rip us out on more than one occasion, we also see them put us back in, almost as if Chris is inviting our control. And if the goal of the player is to seal the fountains of the night work so hard to maintain, and Chris is the knight, then why would they do this? It's counterproductive. How are they supposed to end the world at this rate? Unfortunately, Chris being the knight just doesn't quite add up. And to be honest, for like 2 seconds, the idea that we're told about some mysterious nameless figure, and it turns out to be us, sounds like a twist I would come up with. But that does leave us with a good question. If they are not the knight, then why did Chris make a dark fountain? Well, and this is just speculation, but I think Chris is trying to draw the knight out. Both times we've entered the dark world, the knight has already made their mischief and is long gone. So theoretically, if Chris were to make a dark fountain themselves, then they get into the dark world before the night and hopefully catch them off guard. But of course, who is Chris trying to lure? Well, to recap, before making the fountain, Chris slashes the tires of Toriel's car. That's prompting her to call the police to come over and check it out. So the 4 people who are getting sucked into the dark world this time around will be Chris, Susie, Toriel, and Undyne. The police chief. Think about it. Why would Chris slash the tires? It can't be because Chris doesn't want to go to school the next day, because there is no school the next day. It's almost as if Chris was trying to attract the attention of the police, which would be easy to accomplish in a town with no other crime. In both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, Undyne stands out among the other NPCs since she's the only one that you have the option to tell about the Dark World. And of course, upon telling her about it, she just laughs it off and acts like you're making it all up. Interesting. Then, when Toriel calls the police and the officer on the other end, likely Undyne, says they'll be there soon, why is it that no one shows up for what seems like hours? Could it be that Undyne was busy with something else? Maybe those dog burglars who escaped, or maybe something a bit darker. In Chapter 1, Undyne talks about how nothing ever happens in this town, is dying for something to shake things up. Potential motivation, perhaps? And if not that, then surely it's proof that if Undyne got a call, she would rush over immediately. So why not? As explained by Queen, any Lightner, blade in hand, can create a dark fountain if they are simply determined enough. And as we all know, Undyne is one of the most determined monsters there is. And while not quite matching the knife shown in Queen's demonstration, Undyne does have a spear in Undertale. And if Berdly was about to create a dark fountain near the end of Chapter 2 using his halberd, then it can be assumed that creating one doesn't require a knife specifically, but just any weapon that can pierce the earth. And of course, during the events of Undertale, Undyne also wears knight's armor. If upon entering the Dark World, all Lightner's appearances change to make them look more warrior-like or fantasy-inspired, then it's not impossible for Undyne to enter with an appearance that resembles a knight. And before we enter the computer lab where the second Dark World is, Undyne is right outside. Could it be? Could it be that Undyne was the knight all along? Maybe. We'll just have to wait and see. As for the other, well, let's go back to Spamton. If you do the quest with Spamton and enter the basement of Queen's mansion, you can find a broken down machine with a disc inside. Taking this disc back to Spamton and then returning it to the machine will allow Spamton to take the machine's power for himself, thus starting the fight with Spamton Neo. Then after you beat him, he'll give you a shadow crystal, just like Jevil does. And upon talking to Sham, he'll comment on how Spamton must have found it in the broken down machine. If you examine either of the shadow crystals while they're in your inventory, they'll give you a glimpse of the real world, the spare classroom in Chapter 1 and the computer lab in Chapter 2. And if you examine them in the real world, you see strange things, like Susie making a completely different expression than she's supposed to and Chris seeing straight through their hand. He thinks that maybe the other didn't actually tell Jevil anything, but rather just gave him the Shadow Crystal, which allowed Jevil to learn the truth about the Dark World and how it's all fake, thus prompting his madness. And maybe, given the Shadow Crystal's strange nature, perhaps it actually went a step further and showed Jevil the future. Since if you beat him up, he'll tell you about Queen, who didn't exist as of then, and correctly foretells of her emergence. Plus, this would also explain how Jevil knows about the Knight, and that Sham, formerly the Court Magician, is a shopkeeper now. Two things he couldn't have found out about since his imprisonment. And speaking of whom, if Jevil had been telling Sham strange things about the future, that would explain why he seems to know more than he's letting on. As for Spamton, since it's stated they didn't have the crystal in his possession until the fight with Spamton Neo, that means his strange behavior up until that point isn't connected to any kind of greater truth. But afterwards, Spamton does start saying some truly strange things. First of all, he immediately becomes aware of Chris's soul, something that no other character has mentioned up until now. And back during the first encounter with him, Spamton only knew it as a heart-shaped object. How did he figure out what it actually was? He also keeps mentioning heaven, which is relevant since according to the legend, sealing the Dark Fountain is said to banish the angel's heaven. This, combined with Jel's apparent knowledge of the future, seems to confirm that the Shadow Crystals allow one to see forbidden knowledge, particularly things connected to the end of the world. And we don't actually know where they come from, aside from the fact that they're connected to the other, who has directly interacted with both Jevil and Spamton. But if the other is the source of the Shadow Crystals, then why did they give one to Jevil and then just leave the other one in the broken machine? And where the hell did this busted thing come from anyway? Well, according to Swatch, the mansion shopkeeper, that machine was born from the dream of a certain Lightner, one that he helped to create. Could it be? Could it be that Swatch 2 is connected to the other? Probably not. You see, the Darkners in the game keep talking about how they have this long history with the Lightners, how they all used to live in peace, how they're like gods to them, and so on. But this doesn't make any sense because we know for a fact that most of these worlds can't be more than a day old. And since each Dark World is basically just an ordinary room brought to life, the only explanation is that the history is based on what happened before the Dark Fountain's creation. Allow me to explain. Each character is based on a real-life object. For example, Sham is based on the stuffed doll on the floor of the spare classroom and only gained sentience after the Dark World came to be. Yet he acts as though he's lived a full life, claiming to have collected odds and ends over the course of years. So if the things that happen in the real world turn into the lore and history of a certain room's Dark World, then it can therefore be assumed that everything with a deep history must be based on something that happened before the Knight came in and created the Dark Fountain. So what is the robot then? Well, it's obvious. It's something, probably a gamer app, that somebody was developing in the computer lab but didn't finish programming it, and so it lay abandoned. And furthermore, Swatch must represent a program that served to aid in said development. But then of course, if the machine was a pre-existing thing, then how did the other know about it? Could it be that they were the one who was developing it? I mean, if they were able to make Spamton so successful, then surely they knew their way around the internet. Like they were someone who had expertise with computers and other devices. But no. It can't be. Alphys? Think about it. This may be an alternate world, but this abandoned robot has Alphys' name written all over it. First of all, during the fight with Spamton Neo, your soul turns yellow, allowing you to shoot at him. Just like during the fight with Mettaton EX, a robot designed by Alphys. The shape of the buster cannon and wings match that of Mettaton Neo, and I mean, even the names are similar. Mettaton, Spamton, suspicious. It seems like such a random series of references, right? How do we know Alphys didn't create that busted program herself? I mean, she's definitely no stranger to the library. What if that's why the Shadow Crystal was in the machine? Maybe it was one last attempt to get it working after all attempts had failed in the real world. And not to mention, Spamton has only ever contacted the other over the phone. And you know who else is pretty phone savvy? That's right, Alphys.
Come on, wake up, sheeple! I figured it out, and there is nothing that could possibly prove me wrong! Well, maybe a couple things.
First of all, entry 17. As we all know, the final line says, "What do you two think?" The two, of course, referring to the knight and the other, according to me. But obviously, that poses a problem, since it implies that these forces are working with each other, even though their actions in the Dark World don't seem to be connected in any way. Plus, Alphys and Undyne don't even know each other in real life. So, assuming entry 17 is even relevant at all, this line would only make sense if it was set in the future, after the roaring has already begun and everyone's secrets are out. I mean, after all, it's not like we have any evidence of when it was written. Also, the bunker. Whenever you stand near the bunker, you can hear a slowed down version of the garbage noise that shows up when trying to contact the real world from the Dark World. So either someone left a phone on, or somebody is down there messing with the Dark World as we speak. And if the latter's the case, then whoever it is, well, it's not Alphys and it's not Undyne, who are elsewhere in town. Then of course there's the man behind the tree. After he gives you the egg, he disappears, the reason of which is unknown, and many speculate that he was never there to begin with. So does that open up the possibility that the man who might be Gaster is the other after all? It's impossible to guess what these rooms actually mean, though it is worth mentioning that Chris always enters these rooms alone, and thus Susie and Rousey can never comment on them. Besides, maybe the man behind the tree isn't even Gaster at all. Maybe it's Everyman. You don't know. He's been appearing a lot lately.
Well, given that we've only got some of the game so far, I guess we'll just have to wait and see if any of this is true. Wait, hold on. The gravestones in town. There are 4 of them, right? 1 for Gerson and then 3 for the Amalgamates. Snowdrake's mother, Endogyny, and Lemonbread. But that's weird, isn't it? Because that means among the major Amalgamates, Reaper Bird is completely left out. The very encounter where Everyman makes his first appearance. What could this mean? If the other 3 have gravestones, then does that mean that Everyman is still around? The hell?
Because no. People like you.